First of all, thanks to all of you for coming tonight. Public input is very important for our public agencies in this process. We found over the years, over many years of water quality protection and restoration work, that the insights and suggestions of informed people help technical experts produce better and more workable solutions. So again, thanks for coming, and thanks to all of you logging in on the webinar tonight. Before we get started, let's take a few minutes to introduce the people who are going to be presenting tonight and responding to questions. We'll have them introduce themselves, starting with Josh.
I'm Josh Griffin. I'm a Lake Erie Program Manager with Ohio EPA Division of Surface Water out of our central office, serving as a project manager for the TMDL development.
Good evening. My name is Matt Lane. I work with the Ohio Department of Agriculture and the Division of Soil and Water Conservation.
Hi, I'm Eric Suss. I'm with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. I'm the H2 Ohio Program Manager with ODM. Good to be with you.
All right, thank you. As you know, the purpose of our meeting here tonight is to review the status of the Maumee River total maximum daily load for nutrients, which will address impairments in the western basin of Lake Erie. The topics for the meeting tonight include a presentation on the preliminary modeling results, management choices, a nutrient source assessment updates, and an exploration of implementation options for potential management practices. I think everyone's got a copy of the agenda there. They're on the tables. We'll hear the presentations on those topics by our agency staff, followed by time for comments, questions, and discussion. If you have any clarification questions during the presentations on a particular slide or graph that you see, please raise your hand and we'll address those in real time as we go. There'll also be a little time after each speaker for questions, but for the more general discussion, recommendations, and so forth, we'll have some time at the very end of the presentations. Any questions before we get started? All right, well, we'll start out with Josh Griffin of Ohio EPA. We also have Matt Lane, as you heard, from Ohio Department of Agriculture, and Eric from Ohio DNR. So Josh, if you're ready, podium is yours.
So to get the conversation started today, we wanted to set the stage by talking about what the TMDL is in relation to other work ongoing in the state of Ohio. We have a lofty challenge in front of us, and this isn't the start of the efforts that have a goal of a better Lake Erie. The TMDL is not introducing new targets to the plan to remediate harmful algal blooms. We have the same 40% phosphorus reduction goals from Annex 4, which have been used for Ohio's Domestic Action Plan and H2 Ohio. That goal means we need to develop a plan to achieve 601 metric tons, or nearly 1.3 million pounds of phosphorus reduction from a 2008 baseline condition. The TMDL does require some additional considerations to support management choices made when developing allocations and the implementation plan. While these considerations are explicitly required in the TMDL, they're generally common sense considerations that are naturally part of any process weighing options for implementation. So the term management choices is one that's broadly used to define the decisions that support the waste load and load allocations and implementation plan. Currently, we're evaluating available information to inform those decisions. On the slide, there are some of the management choices that are needed to fulfill the requirements of the preliminary modeling results, including answering the questions: how do we achieve reductions? What an appropriate margin of safety is? How do we plan for growth? And what is an appropriate allocation of load between point and non-point sources? These are all additional considerations that are in Ohio's state code. So there are two places in our revised code where these additional considerations are spelled out. We wanted to share this information to promote a common understanding of the lens we view management choices as the TMDL develops. The first are summarized on this slide are from Ohio Revised Code Chapter 6111.562, Section B. So those in that section of the code, we have considerations for the relative contribution between point and non-point sources, the flow dynamics of the system, the degree reductions to which reductions from point and non-point sources will influence water quality standards, reasonable assurances that reductions can be implemented, considerations for the location of the impairment relative to the source, and also habitat effects that might influence the impairment. The second place is in revised code is right after the first in the same chapter in section C. And for the purposes of the PMR, we have to look at all of these sections to kind of focus our view as we make decisions. So in this section, we have the feasibility of demonstrated technology to meet point source limits, sources of funding, alternative approaches and actions, timing of waste load reductions for point sources, estimated economic impact, and any other stakeholder information that might help make considerations as we evaluate some of these different management choices we have in front of us. As we develop the TMDL, we don't just write down management choices and then fill in answers and considerations as we go. Practically, that would be an inefficient way to facilitate discussion. Rather, we develop our understanding of the watershed by considering the sources of a water quality impairment and how those sources are related to each other. We also consider available water quality data to build on the understanding of how different sources influence the impairment. We shared some information about this part of the TMDL development in last month's webinar. We're going to build on that information today. But new to today's discussion is starting the conversation on cost-effective solutions for achieving phosphorus reductions. Through this process, we'll support the management choices that are part of TMDL development. So, we're always continuing to learn about sources of phosphorus in the Maumee watershed through collaboration and discussion, but also as new research emerges. We shared information about watershed sources recently and continue to develop that information today. We wanted to pause briefly to take questions about some of the groundwork of the TMDL and the additional considerations and management choices. But then we're going to have Matt Lane come up and he's going to take us through some of the work that ODA has been doing to look at agricultural fertilizers in the watershed and how those fertilizers are overseen by the Department of Agriculture. So if anybody has any kind of questions about what those management choices are, just take a moment while Matt gets ready. And
again, I'm Matt Lane with the Department of Agriculture. I just want to take a few minutes and talk about the Department of Agriculture, our role in nutrient regulations in Ohio, the authorities that we have over nutrient regulation, and then talk a little bit about manure as a nutrient source in the Maumee. So just to give you a background of the Department of Agriculture, slide says we have authority over all agricultural nutrient application in Ohio. And there are really three divisions at the department that oversee different types of nutrients. And there probably should be an asterisk up there. There's one type of nutrient that the Ohio Department of Agriculture doesn't have authority over, and that's biosolids. So biosolids produced and applied is regulated by the Ohio EPA. But the vast majority of the nutrients applied within the Maumee fall under ODA's authority. So we have three divisions covering this. The first, let me back up a second. This is all effective January 1st, 2016, that these divisions were consolidated. It used to be that the Division of Soil and Water Conservation was located in another department. It was at the Department of Natural Resources. So at the beginning of 2016, that division moved over to the Department of Agriculture. This was really an intentional choice on Ohio to consolidate authority over nutrients in one agency. With the awareness that nutrients are an ongoing concern, this was a move that was made within the last 10 years to consolidate this authority and have it in one department. The first division that has some authority over, that I'll talk about, that has some authority is the Division of Plant Health. They oversee commercial fertilizer. At the bottom is the revised code chapter where they're authority comes from. So they have a authority over fertilizer. If you're going to sell fertilizer in the state of Ohio and say it has an analysis of, has so much nitrogen in it, they have the authority to make sure that the nitrogen's in the fertilizer. They also have a newer authority. In the last 10 years, they have a fertilizer application certification program. So any person who wants to apply a certain amount of fertilizer in the state has to receive a certification through the Department of Agriculture. And this division also oversees what we would call our Senate Bill 1 regulations, or the restrictions on applying fertilizer onto frozen and snow-covered ground. So this is a newer restriction that came into effect in 2016, where within the Western Lake Erie Basin in Ohio, the application of fertilizer to frozen snow-covered ground is prohibited, and Plant Health oversees those rules. So the second division I want to talk about that has some authority is the Division of Livestock Environmental Permitting. This division oversees the large livestock farms in Ohio. So if there's a certain, I'll talk about the threshold, but if there's a certain amount of animals, they're required to have a permit in the state of Ohio. And this division oversees that. There's going to be a new livestock facility that's going to be over the thresholds. They would have to have a permit to install that would oversee the facility and make sure it's of appropriate size and things that are there. They have to get a permit to install, and then they also have to get a permit to operate, which would oversee things like their manure, how they handle their manure, where their nutrients go, but also other things like controlling pests at the site. So, oh, I went too far. How big is big? These are the thresholds. So, for example, for dairy cattle, if you have over 700 dairy cattle at a site, you would be required to have a permit in the state of Ohio. And the manure applied from that site would fall under the Division of Livestock Environmental Permitting's rules. The third division I want to talk about is the Division of Soil and Water Conservation. They have authority over the manure from all non-permitted facilities. So if you go back slide, if you have under these numbers, 699 dairy cattle, you would fall under, your manure application would fall under the authority of the Division of Soil and Water Conservation. So there are a set of rules there called the Agricultural Pollution Abatement Rules, which are set up to make sure that manure application doesn't pollute waters of the state. This division also enforces the frozen and snow cover application restrictions for manure. Previously it was fertilizer, this is manure. So if manure is applied on frozen snow covered ground, falls under this division. And this division is also overseeing the H2 Ohio efforts for the Ohio Department of Agriculture. So the large effort to provide cost incentives for best management practices to address nutrients is being funded through this division and working with soil and water conservation districts in the Maumee. So that's the boring, oh, talking with my hands. He did it this afternoon, I did it today. That's the overview of our bureaucracy at ODA, who does what, and our restriction or our authority. I also want to talk a little bit about manure, because when we talk about nutrients up in Western Lake Erie Basin, often the question is, what about the manure? How much manure is there? There seems to be a lot more livestock. Is this part of the problem? How much of a part of the problem is it? So the Department of Agriculture, we underwent an effort to try to answer some of those questions. And we are looking at, this is a slide that shows an analysis that we put together looking at the census, two sources of data, the Census of Agriculture and our permitted numbers through the Division of Livestock Environmental Permitting. So we can take those two sources of data and put them together and get a pretty good estimate about how much livestock is in, this is in the Maumee in Ohio. And the census comes out every 5 years, the Census of Agriculture, so that's the progression over time. And on the y-axis, the color bands are kind of by species of livestock. So using those two sources, we can estimate that from 2002 to 2017, we probably have an 88% increase in livestock in the Maumee. To give you a little more context, this is a very similar chart, but longer time scale, goes back to the 50s. It's only for cattle and hogs. It doesn't include chickens, just because chickens are harder to report. I don't have as good numbers for that going back this far in time. But if you look, 2002 is probably the lowest point of animal agriculture in the Maumee in Ohio. The least amount of numbers were there at that time. So we do see a dramatic increase in the past 15 years, but starting probably from a historic low. So the next question is, okay, we've seen an 88% increase in manure in the Maumee, or in animals, and probably manure being produced. How much manure is that? Is that too much manure? Is that too much phosphorus for the watershed to handle? Because we do have a need for phosphorus, right? We're planting crops, we're growing crops every year, and those crops take off tens of thousands of tons of phosphorus as they're harvested. So there's a need as we're growing agricultural commodities to fertilize the soil. And how much that fertilizer need is being fed by this manure. So we can estimate, by figuring out the amount of phosphorus in the manure, how much manure is being produced, how much phosphorus is taken off by the crops. That right now, probably about 20% of our phosphorus need for the crops can be fed by manure phosphorus. And we would say that the other 80% right now is probably being supplemented by commercial fertilizer. So the answer to the question is, in the watershed in the whole, in the Maumee, in Ohio, there's not too much manure. There's enough, and not too much phosphorus in the manure. There's enough need in the crops being grown that we're not oversupplying phosphorus and manure.
Question.
Go ahead.
How did you, what data did you use to develop the need?
So what data do we use to develop the need? We go and look at, so there's a number published based in like the Tri-State Fertility Guide. That's the amount of phosphorus contained in a bushel of grain. And then we look at the acreage and yield goals for the watershed. That makes sense. You're gonna say this acre is gonna grow 200 bushel corn, this much phosphorus is in every bushel, and that would be the crop removal rate. So it's a rough estimate, right? But it should hold relatively true across the watershed. So, and we've seen this, we can look at fertilizer information too. The Division of Plant Health, the first division I talked about that oversees fertilizer, they keep logs of how much fertilizer is sold in Ohio. And so we've seen as the amount of manure being produced in the Maumee is going up, we've seen the amount of fertilizer, commercial fertilizer being sold and used in the Maumee going down. And so we think it's a proportional, as manure becomes available, people are buying less commercial fertilizer. And we do have a source that kind of backs up this observation. Dr. Libby Dayton at the Ohio State University looked at soil tests in the Maumee. She's looked at soil tests over time. And so the soil tests show how much phosphorus is available and there in the soil. If phosphorus were being over applied in the region, more than the crops are taken off, your soil test would go up. And if you're taking off more phosphorus in the crop than you're fertilizing, your soil test will go down. And over time, she's seeing that soil tests in this region are declining. So that's another indication that we're not seeing an over application of phosphorus in the Maumee. So I think that's the end of my brief explanation of our analysis of manure and trends in the Maumee.
So for the next part of the presentation, we're going to kind of look at the role of hydrology. Last month, we shared information from a USDA ARS study that evaluated changes in annual precipitation throughout the watershed. Generally, total rainfall and rainfall intensity have been increasing in the watershed, especially in the southern portion. We're building upon that discussion today because changes in watershed hydrology driven by precipitation and probably some other factors are an important part of what has driven loading changes for dissolved reactive phosphorus. In another study by Anne Chaquette from USGS, and she collaborated with some local researchers. Laura Johnson from Heidelberg in particular is a familiar name in the watershed. They completed a study that demonstrated that changes in stream flow explain a third of the increase in dissolved reactive phosphorus. So clearly something that we need to be thinking about as we work on the TMDL. To add some emphasis to how striking the changes have been, we can look at recent precipitation data in a different way by putting it into context of the historical record. Aaron Wilson, a climatologist with Ohio State Extensions, discusses this in his work, and he has a webinar with the Ohio Agronomic Crops YouTube channel. It's worth watching if you want to really have someone who really understands the weather and the climate in the region explain it to you. I really recommend watching it. I found it fascinating. But he specifically highlights that 5 of the 10 wettest years on record have occurred since 2000. 2000 happens to be a bit of an inflection point for the trend in dissolved reactive phosphorus loads in the Maumee River. So here's a plot looking at those trends. So we previously shared that phosphorus export trends in the Maumee watershed is a great place to start understanding sources. Today, we're going to focus on the trend in dissolved reactive phosphorus loads. The light blue dots on this plot represent the flow normalized loads, and the dark blue dots are the actual measured load in a year. Flow normalizing is an analysis method that makes patterns more evident by reducing the the influence of interannual flow variability on total load. So the analysis makes it evident that there was a rise in dissolved reactive phosphorus in the late 1990s through the early 2000s that's mostly sustained. This change has been directly connected to the start of the Western Lake Erie annual harmful algal blooms. And here we're kind of highlighting these two windows with this inflection point in the trend, really kind of centering around the year 2000. So we're working with those two windows here. So as we continue to explore the monitoring data from the watershed, we can look for new ways to visualize watershed loading changes that resulted in water quality degradation in Lake Erie. To create this plot, we split that frame around the year 2000 to visualize how recent loading observations compare to those from the longer term record. The plot highlights the two phenomenon driving the changes in DRP load in the watershed. First, the relationship between flow and load. So the x-axis being flow, so like the total discharge from the Maumee, and the y-axis being load. So this relationship was different in the two time periods. And that speaks to the DRP concentrations being higher. So as you know, for that relationship to be higher, the concentration of phosphorus would have to be higher. Flow, concentration, make load. But also, we see that the 5 highest discharge years have occurred since 1983, when the earliest period of this, so about when the Heidelberg monitoring began, have occurred since the year 2000. So that's depicted as these black dots on the screen. So it really is a way to look at this recent phenomenon in weather and how this extreme weather is really playing a role in what we've seen in the last couple of decades. So by evaluating the data available in the Maumee watershed, we see that extreme weather is an important part of what has changed. While these trends are emerging, there's uncertainty in climate and watershed models that obscure projections looking forward. In part, this is because changes in weather can have positive and negative impacts on phosphorus loading. For example, increasing total precipitation and increasing intensity of precipitation can increase phosphorus loads. But on the other hand, warmer temperatures can increase evapotranspiration, and cropping patterns adapting to a longer growing season could reduce total flow, and phosphorus loads. So with these observations, we can ask the question about how we can build resilience into a TMDL amid uncertainty. Our end goal is delisting water quality impairments on Lake Erie. Those impairments are delisted based on responses measured in the lake, and Ohio's obligations to improve water quality continue until the lake is delisted. We can also utilize adaptive management to react to new information and research as it becomes available. In current planning efforts, we can keep this in mind and not only focus on nutrient management practices, but also ensure that water management is part of the conversation of implementation. Water management practices can build climate resilience into the implementation plan. Eric Sauce is with us here. He's gonna talk to us next about how wetlands can help fill that role in some of the research that we're ensuring takes place as we implement those practices. But that wraps up what I have for this hydrology piece.
Nice to be with you this evening. Thanks for taking time out of your evening to learn about this topic, learn what we're working on. I want to talk about the collaboration that we have through H2 Ohio and how that underpins all the effort that we're taking on the implementation end already. We've got a little bit of a head start on trying to attack the problem of non-point source nutrient loading. So I am not Christina Kuechly, but I work with Christina Kuechly. She represented our program earlier. I'm Eric Sauce. I'm the H2 Ohio Program Manager for the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. So really kind of the power of what we're doing through H2 Ohio is all of us sitting around the table working together on the problem of the untenable green slime beaches that we have at Maumee Bay State Park and in the western basin of Lake Erie, or other inland lakes across the state. We're all through H2 Ohio harnessing the unique expertise and experience we have in our own lanes attacking this issue. So I really want to focus today on ODNR's part of this H2 Ohio initiative. We focus on what you could call a natural infrastructure approach. Our counterparts at Ohio EPA are invested in a maybe more traditional gray infrastructure approach, water to wastewater, home septic. And we look at, what can the Ohio Department of Natural Resources do in this arena, and we look to natural infrastructure. So wetland restoration, wetland creation, wetland enhancement, floodplain reconnection, establishing better connections with our diked coastal marshes along Lake Erie, promoting that interaction between nutrient-laden surface water and the soils and plants that can settle out, process those nutrients, and absorb the storm flows and the peak stream flow. There's been enough literature review of this type of approach to suggest that it is cost effective. What we're putting on the landscape is long term, delivers benefits year after year. And of course, we all like the win-win. When we look at wetland restoration, we're focused on that through our program from a nutrient reduction, pollutant reduction standpoint, but there are plenty of other reasons why we love wetlands. We bird watch, we duck hunt, we fish, we go hiking with our families. These bring additional benefits to the communities where we're carrying out these restoration projects. And as we look at the H2 Ohio practices, we're right there in that the top 10 practices that were identified at the outset of H2 Ohio. The Ohio Department of Agriculture is focusing on the first 7 practices on that list, soon to be 8, I believe. really keeping the nutrients where they belong, on the field, growing crops, and out of our streams and lakes. And then we're focused on that number 10, wetlands, and to some extent edge of field buffers as well. So conceptually, we lead with a nutrient reduction approach with our project prioritization, but our work really lives at the intersection of a purely nutrient management approach and a habitat restoration approach. Of all of our H2 Ohio projects that we've funded so far at the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, every one of these projects has some characteristics of nutrient management and habitat restoration. It has to be both of those things to be an ODNR H2 Ohio project. And we feel like when we have a directionally correct approach, probably the worst thing that we could do is nothing. So we have invested heavily in this approach and moved swiftly. Starting in 2019, really kicking off our first set of projects in 2020. We now have 83 individual projects that are either completed or in progress. Many of these, the bulk of these are wetland restoration projects, some wetland creation and some wetland enhancement projects. Question? So our program is currently statewide. These stats represent the statewide program approach. If I flip real quick to the next slide, you can see the bulk of our investment has been in the Western Lake Erie Basin. When we look at fiscal year 22, fiscal year 23 funding, 60% of our funding is earmarked for the Western Lake Erie Basin. But we do have a statewide program at this point. So I don't have the stats sliced up, and that probably would have been a good idea for the context of this presentation, to show that we have something around 55 of those projects that are in the Western Lake Erie Basin, but then subdividing out the other statistics would be hard to do on the fly. Other important things to note here, I mean, we have a nearly $90 million investment in this approach. Currently, around 11,700 acres of ecosystem restoration with that water quality emphasis. We don't do all this work alone. The way our program operates, we engage with conservation partners who are our grant awardees. They manage these projects on the ground. And like I said, we've got about 15 or so projects that are actually completed at this point, and we're hoping to add 20 additional projects to that list over the course of this calendar year as completed H2 Ohio projects that are serving their function on the landscape. In addition to those 83 projects, when I flip to the next slide, you'll see some additional gray dots on the map. The Ohio Department of Natural Resources has partnered with the Lake Erie Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, the USDA program, where we're adding an additional cash benefit incentive on top of CREP enrollment for certain specific practices that we know to have staying power on the landscape. That's wetland restoration, floodplain wetland restoration, and forested riparian buffer. So we have, at this point, it's actually nearly 200 landowners who have taken advantage of our one-time cash incentive to enroll in those practices in Lake Erie CREP. So on this map, you can see, as I alluded to before, our emphasis in the Maumee River watershed and the Western Lake Erie Basin. We also have projects in the Central Lake Erie drainage, and we are now in our second round of a competitive grant application program in the Ohio River watershed. Not necessarily pertinent to this discussion, but in case you're interested. So like I said, in this current fiscal year and the next fiscal year, 60% of our funding is allocated toward that Western Lake Erie Basin. Making good progress so far. It's always good to get out and see the finished product. I'd have to say it's quite a joy of my experience and my team to take a project from thought to reality in such a quick span of time. This shows us at a few of our ribbon cuttings last summer for completed restoration projects, and we're looking forward to adding more to the role this summer. So, when I was at our local Metro Park last weekend at the Nature Center with my kids, there was a display talking about the benefits of wetlands, and they had a sponge and a filter and a bar of soap talking about how a wetland does all these different things. And we know that's the case, but we know that there's, for our purposes, a little asterisk that you want to put next to each one of those things. And you want to say, yeah, a wetland is a filter most of the time, but there are times when it's not. And it's important for us to recognize what those times are, or maybe what those designs or situations are for wetlands when they aren't performing quite as well as we would hope. So to that end, we have engaged with the academic community directly to help us look at the project work that we're putting on the ground, tweak our approach, highlight projects for us that are doing well, ones that aren't, and how we need to adaptively manage our H2Ohio program. We're very fortunate that we've been able to engage with the Lake Erie and Aquatic Research Network to both develop and implement a wetland monitoring program focused on the nutrient reduction effectiveness of every one of our H2Ohio projects. Some of the projects they're looking at will be very intensively monitored, others in a more kind of red flag, directionally correct sense, but every one of our projects will get addressed by the Lake Erie and Aquatic Research Wetlands and Water Quality Research Team. You can see here half a dozen institutions, dozens and dozens of researchers, students, techs, working on this question for us. So that's it in a nutshell.
So, we're going to move towards a discussion on implementation. So to move in that direction, we wanted to revisit a slide that we've shared previously in our TMDL outreach materials about what TMDLs can and can't do. We want this to be kind of here as we talk about options for implementation. So TMDLs are planning tools used to allocate pollutants to different sources. TMDLs do establish waste load allocations that are implemented in NPDES permits. TMDLs do provide technical details that can be used by local coordinators to develop non-point source pollution reduction implementation plans. TMDLs do encompass both point and non-point source contributions. TMDLs don't change policy or legal authority of implementing agencies. So as we talk about implementation options, I think we got to understand that what the TMDL is doing in this context. So while the TMDL cannot change policy, certain policy changes have occurred in response to harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie. These policies have brought additional funding through programs like H2Ohio, as well as additional requirements for nutrient applicators. We heard about some of those from Matt earlier. And as we continue to develop the TMDL, the implementation plan will need to consider the impact of those practices, of those policy changes that have occurred. So here's our way of visualizing how we eventually break out the allocations in this TMDL. So in the total donut on this graphic is a representation of the total 2008 loading. We have a remaining allocation for non-point sources and a remaining allocation for point sources. And ultimately, our goal is to achieve that 40% reduction. That's that 601 metric tons. So, we're after a plan to achieve 601 metric tons of phosphorus reduction. There may be some additional considerations within the reductions that we need to take to account for a margin of safety in the model. We haven't determine a margin of safety. There's certainly a fair amount of conservative modeling that's taking place here. We're monitoring directly in the watershed. So there's a lot to talk about with margin of safety still. We're not going to get into that here, but it may be something we have to account for with some additional reductions. Within that, then we have to look at where our opportunities are for reductions. And within those opportunities, there's going to be opportunities to affect all of these different source categories. And kind of generally, these are the source categories we talked about when we did the source assessment webinar earlier this month. So it may not be everything. There's always one more source category, and we shouldn't discount that. So there's always, if there's another source and there's an opportunity there, we should always consider it. And there are opportunities for both point sources and non-point sources. And there's some, from an implementation perspective, there are some kind of interesting nuance with the non-point source load, in that we're not just talking about source reduction and managing non-point sources. We're also talking about the natural infrastructure and enhancing our non-point source sinks. So we're writing a plan, and we have we've been looking at our plan, kind of through this lens, is that we don't just achieve non-point source reduction by managing sources. We are also looking at the value of natural infrastructure, the wetland restoration, stream restoration, floodplain reconnection, these kind of tenets of ODNR's role in implementing the H2 Ohio initiatives. And another, so then one final point, I think with this graphic is these are our source categories, and we need to manage those through implementation. There's not one option to manage agricultural nutrients. Agricultural nutrients both come from a diversity of sources. We have commercial fertilizer, manure, biosolids, all utilized as, get that thing again, all utilized as agricultural fertilizers. And the practices that would influence that is your nutrient management planning, nutrient incorporation, and there's more. There's not one practice that influences any source category. And then additionally, there's not, some practices are going to influence multiple source categories. And it's one of the challenges with non-point source implementation is there's, how do practices stack together? How do they interact with each other? And how do they interact with multiple source categories? So a wetland might have a greater effect if it's in an opportune location where loadings are higher. If it's treating more runoff from an area that's more likely has higher phosphorus concentrations than an area that we know doesn't have high phosphorus concentrations, it might be more effective. So as we kind of look at how we evaluate these opportunities, there's kind of a nexus of sources as we look at them. So, and again, appreciate your time today. Thank you.